YouTube's favorite geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan has recently made huge waves with his wild prediction that
we are looking at the end of China as a political entity within a decade or two, and as an economic entity within a decade.
But is this prediction about China's imminent collapse based on solid arguments, or is it just sensationalist nonsense meant to get views? To find out, I've spent the last weeks diving deep into the data and logic supporting Mr. Zeihan's arguments and comparing them to arguments and evidence put forward by other experts. And first of all, I have to give Mr. Zeihan credit because his main arguments for this bold prediction are based on 4 big problems with the Chinese economy that are absolutely real. Namely, that China is getting old so fast that it will lose a significant share of its population in the upcoming decades, that the country relies heavily on importing the most crucial goods for any economy, food and energy, that its debt-fueled investment-led growth model is quickly running out of steam as its gigantic housing bubble pops, and finally that the country is increasingly authoritarian, which means that its leader is getting more isolated and therefore potentially will not be able to respond to these problems. But are these problems really so bad that they will lead to the collapse of the Chinese economy in the next 10 years? Or is Mr. Zeihan making them look far worse than they are to support his narrative? After all, Mr. Zeihan has been predicting that China's economy will collapse in the next decade already since 2010, which so far has not happened. Well, after taking a closer look at his arguments, I came to the conclusion that most of these problems are either not as bad as they seem or will likely not lead to a collapse due to the unique structure of the Chinese economy. So let's dive into each of these arguments now, starting with Mr. Zeihan's main argument about China's demographic collapse. The core of this argument is that, as Zeihan writes in the US financial newspaper Barron's, China's labor force and population have already peaked in the 2010s, and China's population will be half by 2050. And this is a problem for 2 reasons. First, it is a problem on the demand side because
most of the consumption in a modern system happens when you're in your 20s and your 30s, when you're buying cars and raising kids and building homes.
And second, it is a problem on the supply side because
without young people, we've seen their labor costs increase by a factor of 14 since the year 2000. So Mexican labor is now 1/3 the cost of Chinese labor.
And
so despite $1 trillion of investment in a bottomless supply of intellectual property theft, they really haven't advanced technologically in the last 15 years.
And therefore,
and now it's obvious that this system is breaking down. The demographic collapse is not correctable. There are not enough people under age 40 for them to even try, even if they had the macroeconomic structures that allowed or encouraged people to have families of their own.
So, okay, just to recap, an irreversible demographic collapse will decimate Chinese consumers and increase labor costs, which will decimate Chinese competitiveness as they will be outcompeted by countries like Mexico. Now, immediately what Mr. Zeihan said about most consumption being done by people in their 20s and 30s really didn't sound right to me. And indeed, when I looked into it, I found that in modern systems, no, most consumption is actually done by those over 35 years old, simply because they earn more money. For example, as you can see here in this graph for the United States, it is true that the young typically spend more than they earn, given that the light blue bar is bigger than the dark blue bar. However, this does not mean that they consume more, as the light blue bars, which represent total expenditures, are still bigger for older age groups, simply because their income is higher. So even if there are fewer young people in China, this will not decimate consumption immediately. Similarly, I was actually very skeptical of Mr. Zeihan's claim that China did not advance technologically in the last 15 years, given that I know that in these years they have come to dominate various advanced industries, such as telecommunications, electric vehicles, drones, phones and solar panels. And indeed, when I checked by looking at Harvard's Economic Complexity database, which ranks economies based on how advanced their exports are, China clearly moved up the value chain quite a lot in the last 15 years, even surpassing Mexico a few years ago. So the fact that Chinese labor costs are now higher than those in Mexico will not necessarily kill its industries, just as Japan's wages being higher than those in China does not mean that Japan's entire industry will collapse. But okay, even though some of Mr. Zeihan's arguments are clearly not true, most experts I found agreed that China's demographic decline is still a really big problem, and as Zeihan often mentions, probably not correctable through immigration. And indeed, as you can see from the red line in this graph published by The Economist, China's working age population has indeed already peaked and will likely fall rapidly. However, that still does not mean that China will collapse, because after taking a closer look, I found 3 more big problems with Zeihan's analysis. First of all, while there are many estimates about China's population trajectory, Mr. Zeihan only talks about the most extreme population projection that he could find. Importantly, he does refer to legitimate research, I have to admit. However, he hardly ever mentions that there are other well-known studies, such as this one in the prestigious medical journal The Lancet, which estimates that China's population will only halve by 2100, not 2050. Or that the UN is even more optimistic, as it believes China's population will only shrink by 8% up to 2050. Of course, Mr. Zeihan might very well be correct to pick the most pessimistic research. However, I still think it is important to keep in mind that this is what he does. He picks the most pessimistic view. The second problem, though, is more problematic. You see, well, Zeihan is right that China's population decline will probably not be offset by immigration. He fails to mention that there are other options, especially to offset the decline in the labor force. For example, legendary Financial Times economics commentator Martin Wolf has argued that the fall in China's working age population for the next 10 years, represented by this blue bar, can actually be fully compensated by moving more people from China's underdeveloped villages to the cities, which is this light blue bar here, and the rest of it can be made up by simply increasing the retirement age above 60, which is represented by the final blue bar over here. And then we haven't even talked about the third big problem with Mr. Zeihan's demographic story, and that is that historically the connection between demographics and economic performance is really not that clear. After all, as you can see here, China's population surged well before its economy took off. What's more, there are other countries, like for example Nigeria, that saw a huge population increase and not much of an economic increase. Similarly, there are countries like Bulgaria, which lost almost 10% of its population last decade, but whose economy still grew quite a bit as workers got more productive. And given that Chinese productivity really has not yet caught up to even a country like Poland, it's really quite possible that China's economy will keep growing as its population shrinks, just as Bulgaria's economy did. Still, while Zeihan might get some basic facts wrong and might overstate the damage that a population decline will have in the next 10 years, his assessment that China's population decline is exceptionally fast and will be damaging is shared by most experts that I found, including those in the Chinese government, by the way, which has therefore relaxed its one-child policy and put in place other measures to encourage bigger families. However, as Mr. Zeihan notes in his Barron's piece, this all might not matter given that, unlike the US, China imports the vast majority of its energy as well as the inputs used to grow its food. And that brings us to Zeihan's second argument about China's imminent demise, which is that China faces a food and energy disaster as the US Navy retreats. But before we dive deeper, let's address a reality that many of us face online: the threat of account hijacking and phishing attempts. Today's sponsor, Guardio, protects against this, saving folks like me from the endless task of cleaning up hacked account in our communities. There's a common belief that two-factor authentication is a cybersecurity cure-all. Yet even I know fellow YouTubers who have suffered account breaches due to malware slipping through this defense. This is where Guardio comes in. Once installed and activated, they will continuously protect all of your information, notifying you in real time on your phone about any data leaks or if any phishing email has passed your spam folder. More than that, Guardio blocks malicious websites, dubious browser extensions, and unsafe downloads. Even then, if a scam does slip through, you will have Guardio's 24/7 support with advice on what to do next. Trusted by over 1 million users and even featured by Google, Guardio ensures top-notch security without breaking the bank. With a quick, free security scan, you're moments away from peace of mind. Visit guard.io/moneymacro to get a free browser scan and a 7-day trial of premium features. If you then like the service, you can get it for 20% off as a Money and Macro viewer. Now, with confidence that Guardio is safeguarding our digital world, let's dive back into why China faces a food and energy disaster as the US Navy retreats. An argument that comes from Zeihan's latest book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, in which he predicts that having secured energy independence, the US is likely to stop policing the global oceans, which means that international trade will once again be vulnerable to piracy. And China, well, according to Zeihan, China is...
They are the most vulnerable country in the world right now. And based on how things go with Russia, we're looking at a significant amount of raw materials falling off the map, specifically food and energy. And the Chinese are the world's largest importer of both of those things. So there's no version of this where China comes through looking good. And the challenge for the rest of us is to figure out how do we, in as smooth and quick as a process as possible, figure out how we can get along without them. Because they are going away. And they're going away this decade, for certain.
But again, after a bit of digging, I found 3 big problems with this argument. First, and most obviously, the fact that China should depend on the US Navy for protection from pirates is something I really couldn't find any other expert being concerned about. Confusingly, Mr. Zeihan himself states in an interview that the US Navy is no longer ideal for protecting merchant ships as it relies too much on aircraft carriers that can destroy small nations like Iraq and not enough on ships that can patrol the global oceans. Which was weird to me given that China's Navy has actually focused on smaller ships and has thereby already overtaken the US Navy when it comes to the number of ships that it operates, as you can see in this graph here from the BBC. And given that the Chinese are increasingly building bases overseas, to say that the Chinese need the US Navy to protect their merchant ships from pirates just seems hopelessly outdated to me. But okay, I did find that most experts still consider the US Navy the more powerful one. So maybe in a conflict with the US, China could still face crippling energy and food problems. Right? Well, no. Sure, on the surface, Mr. Zeihan is absolutely correct that China imports more food and energy than it exports, and that this has gotten worse over time. However, after digging a little bit deeper into why, I found that one of the main reasons for this is likely that China simply got richer, and after a couple of food scandals at home, the Chinese started to develop a preference for imported foods. A second reason is that, as Mr. Zeihan says, farmland is relatively scarce in China. For that reason, food is indeed more expensive to produce in China, which has allowed foreign farmers to outcompete the Chinese ones. But that doesn't mean that China will starve. After all, if China's access to foreign food gets compromised, then Chinese farmers will once again become more competitive. But then you might say, Joeri, aha, farming takes a long time. The Chinese cannot restart farming quickly in case of an emergency. And yes, that is probably why the Chinese government has been building a large national stockpile of food, precisely to weather the emergency that Mr. Zeihan predicts could very well cripple it. So yes, food security is a potential problem in China, but in my opinion, it is really not as bad as Mr. Zeihan makes it out to be, which is very similar to what I found for energy. Yes, sure, China is currently depending on foreign energy products and gets lots of it from Russia. So if Russia were to collapse, that would be a big problem for them. But it wouldn't be catastrophic. The United States has sanctioned some of the biggest energy producers in the world, like Iran and Venezuela, all of whom are now friends with China. So it could also get energy products from them. And just as with food, the Chinese government has been stockpiling oil just in case of an emergency and is working hard to become energy independent by investing massively into alternative energy sources such as coal, as well as clean ones such as solar and wind power. So just as with food and the dependence on the US Navy, while Mr. Zeihan could of course be correct, I was not at all convinced by his arguments and the evidence that he presented. Luckily, I was much more convinced by the evidence that Zeihan used to back up his next argument, which is China's failing growth model. And more than that, I was actually really impressed by Zeihan's simple explanation that
the Chinese follow a capital-intensive investment model.
And that
all of the East Asians have followed this pattern to a certain degree. The problem with this pattern and this type of growth is if you do it enough, you start to distort the economy and you absorb more and more capital and more labor and more resources, and eventually you get to the point where there's diminishing returns because you only need so many roads, you only need so many factories. In the case of Japan, they reached this point in the 1980s, and they went from having stratospheric growth, because this generates a lot of economic activity, to just kind of a stall out.
Because that comparison with Japan is basically aligned with the story of China expert Professor Michael Pettus, who is one of the most influential analysts on this issue at the moment. But this also highlights the problem that I have with Zeihan's story, because unlike Professor Pettus, Zeihan does not predict a Japan-style stagnation, he predicts an economic collapse. Because unlike in Japan at the time,
China, you're talking about a complete wipeout for what for most Chinese citizens is their primary and maybe even only method of savings.
And that
it's going to do so by ripping the heart out of public support for the entire system and the CCP and the government in particular.
Now, of course, I cannot fact-check whether or not the CCP will lose support because this has not happened yet. But I was not convinced by Zeihan's argument that the Chinese households are so much more exposed than the Japanese were in the 1990s because they can only invest in housing. You see, while it is true that the Japanese could invest in the stock market more freely at the time, it didn't help them that much because the stock market collapsed along with the housing market in the 1990s. Still, Zeihan is right that an asset bubble at the end of a growth model can collapse an economy, as the US economy did collapse in a similar manner in the 1930s. However, the reason that most experts believe that China's economy will stagnate like Japan rather than collapse like the USA did in the 1930s is that China's banks are state-controlled and that to keep popular support, the CCP will likely keep the financial system from collapsing, limiting the losses of households. Unless, of course, Mr. Zeihan is right that China's increased authoritarianism will prevent it from responding adequately to all of these crises because...
And Chairman Xi is so purged of the system that it's an open question whether he can even become aware in a reasonable amount of time that something needs to be done, much less have the capability to come up with a coherent policy to deal with whatever the issue is as it arises.
And increased authoritarianism is definitely an issue most China watchers are concerned about, as it can make a country far less attractive for foreign investment, it doesn't help to keep talented workers in the country, and indeed might cause a leader to make increasingly stupid decisions, as nobody is willing to tell them the truth. But so far, I just don't see that This is already as bad as Mr. Zeihan has been telling us. After all, for each of the major issues that Zeihan highlighted and that I've looked into, I've consistently found relevant government policy, coherent government policy addressing it. The Chinese are trying to get people to have more babies, they are modernizing their navy, they are stockpiling and investing in food and energy, and they were actually the ones to pop the property bubble because they thought it was getting too big. So I just don't see any evidence that supports Zeihan's statement that Xi has purged the system so thoroughly already that he can no longer respond to the problems coherently. And so, having gone through all of Mr. Zeihan's main arguments, I've now come to my conclusion, which I've stated in the beginning of the video, was that most of these problems are either not as bad as they seem or will likely not lead to a collapse due to the unique structure of the Chinese economy, with which I meant that it's led by state-owned banks. So what does that mean for Mr. Zeihan? How did he do during this fact-checking exercise? Well, for me, it depends on your expectations. If you expected Mr. Zeihan to be an oracle of the truth, then I think this shows that you should really reconsider. However, for me personally, and judging by some of the comments that you made on a post that I made, following Zeihan is not about learning the absolute truth. It is about getting interesting and provocative insights. And because in my career as an economist, I've never ever come across anyone that can consistently predict the future in such certain terms that Mr. Zeihan likes to use, such as, this country will collapse in 10 years, I've always taken his extreme predictions with a very large grain of salt. And so I'm happy to say that after this fact-checking analysis, which was quite critical, let's be honest, I will actually continue to follow Mr. Zeihan in the way that I did, to get a broad overview and an interesting perspective on global affairs. But if I'm doing serious research, I will not rely too much on the work of Mr. Zeihan, because for that I think he is too sloppy and too committed to the story that he has been telling for such a long time. But yeah, that's my take. And while I reached out to Zeihan's team for comments before publishing this video, I did not receive a response yet. Hopefully he will still do so in the comments of this video. Lastly, I want to note that I am more positive, I think, in the conclusion of this video than in similar videos that I did criticizing, for example, Johnny Harris and Economics Explained, because of two reasons. The first is that Zeihan largely gets the big stuff right, even if he takes it sometimes to a ridiculous extreme. The second reason is that Zeihan does not present himself as a teacher or an educator, but as a speculative analyst. And yeah, I think just that teachers should be held to higher standards because their audience is less experienced. Is that fair? Or have I been too generous? Let me know in the comments, and if you think peer review kind of videos like this are essential for the YouTube information ecosystem, then consider supporting my channel on Patreon or by becoming a member, or maybe by buying me an online coffee using the links in the description of this video. Finally, if you're watching this, it could be that I just released my own in-depth video about the Chinese growth miracle and why it's now stagnating, and you can check it out over here. But if I didn't do so yet, then consider checking out this playlist over here that contains my other fact-checking videos.